going? Welcome to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter LaBelle. Syria, when a pullout, well, doesn't mean a pullout. Also, Venezuela, how's that regime change going? And the botched story known as Brexit. And much, much more on this edition of Crosstalk. Cross-talking some real news. I'm joined by the one and only Dmitry Babich here in Moscow. He's a political analyst with Sputnik International. And in Athens, we cross to Alex Christoforou. He is the director and writer for the Duran.com. All right, gentlemen, crosstalk rules in effect. That means you can jump in anytime you want, and I always appreciate it. All right, Alex, let me go to you in Athens here. We have this pullout down from 2,000 to 200. Now it's 400. What is the narrative here? What is the reasoning behind it? And why should we believe it's the pullout's going to happen at all? Because the narrative has changed so many times since December. Go ahead in Athens.
Well, we've moved from a withdrawal, Peter, to an occupation. And, let's be clear, this is becoming an occupation. And of course, they're using the pretext of protecting the Kurds and staying in Syria for those reasons. But what it really is the neocons once again inserting themselves in Trump's foreign policy. And I won't even say inserting. They are leading Trump's foreign policy. Once again, you always have the specter of John Bolton and Mike Pompeo kind of sitting in the background as Trump is announcing one of his major campaign promises. He campaigned on getting the U.S. out of all these military entanglements, specifically Syria. In 2013, Trump sent 3, 4, maybe even 5 tweets saying, what is Obama doing in Syria? If I was president, I would get out. He announced that he was going to withdraw from 2,000. Now we've got to 200 troops are going to stay, and we're going to go to 400. And Peter, the question is, are we going to go in 3 months' time to 1,000 troops?
Yeah.
How long are we going to stay in Syria? Is it going to be 10 years, 20 years? Is this going to be like Afghanistan? Are we looking at a 20-year occupation of the country? So no one really knows at which direction this is going. But one thing's for sure, the neocons are running Trump's foreign policy.
Dima, one of the interesting things the Kurds have brought up all of the time, but logic would dictate, and the entire history of the conflict would dictate, that the Damascus government and the Kurds huddle together and hammer out some kind of agreement, because during the course of this conflict, the Kurds and the Damascus government have really had very few direct conflicts here. So this is a ruse here. It looks like to me, and I like what Alexander Christoforou said, this is an occupation in search of a mission, and it may have a lot more to do with pleasing the Israelis and, quote unquote, keeping their eye on the Iranians. And also, and I think is very, very important here, is to be the ultimate spoiler in ending this conflict that never should have happened in the first place. Dino.
Well, it's absolutely, you're right about almost all of your points. I would say that with the Kurds, the fantastic thing was that when the United States announced that they are pulling out of northeastern Syria, and everyone expected the Turks to enter Manbij, then suddenly the Kurdish militia said, no, we would prefer the Syrian government to be there. And this was such a huge blow to the narrative of the Western press, because the narrative in the European Union and the United States was that there is nothing worse than the Assad government. The Kurds are going to be terrified. All the people in Syria are terrified. And then these people invite the Syrian forces to Manbij. But also, I'm just putting myself in the position of someone who reads newspapers in Washington and tries to make sense of it all. What does that person read in the Washington Post? Josh Rogin, Trump steps back from the brink of disaster in Syria. That reminds me, of the Soviet joke. We were standing on the brink of a precipice, but thank God we made a huge step forward, The latest news from the New York Times is that actually they first increased the number of U.S. troops in northeast Syria to 3,000, right? And now Trump is talking about hundreds of staying. Hundreds, how many? 20 hundreds? That means the whole contingent would stay.
It's really interesting. Let me go back to Athens. Alex, also this this move, if it's, I don't know how stable it is, this decision, actually gets Erdogan off the hook to resolve the issues in Idlib. So again, this lack of clarity coming out of Washington is a barrier to ending this conflict, because we are in the penultimate moment. And now it looks like we're back to square one in how this conflict is going to end. It's frustrating Russia. It's frustrating Iran. It's frustrating, maybe in a positive way for the Turks here. But maybe that's the whole point, isn't it? It's just to churn up this quagmire, keep it going. We know the Trump administration said this before the end of last year. So it looks like this plan of churning and turning this quagmire is actually the real underlying policy. Alex, go ahead in Athens.
Yeah, I think, we've said it over and over, and it's really about occupation. And to me, the most disheartening part of all of this, Peter, is that these are really self-inflicted wounds that Trump is putting onto himself, the Trump administration is putting onto themselves. The conflict in Syria can be resolved very, very quickly if the U.S. would just pull out, and they would allow the Kurds to talk to the Syrian government, and that's the key word, what Dimitri said, the Syrian government, the internationally recognized, legitimate Syrian government. These are who the Kurds need to be talking with in order to resolve this conflict once and for all. But the fact that you're keeping 200, and now it's 400, and in 3 months it'll be 1,000, and in 6 months it'll be 5,000, the fact that this is happening is just delaying the process of bringing peace to Syria. That's the bottom line, and it's really also going to hurt Trump in 2020. He needs to realize this. His constituency, his voters, they don't know why the U.S. is in Syria, and they want out of Syria. This is hurting him in the end.
Okay, Dima, Alex just used the phrase self-inflicted wound. Let's revisit the Warsaw Conference, the anti-Iran Warsaw Conference. Would you give a scorecard for our audience? Winners, losers? Was anything achieved? Go ahead.
Well, it's just amazing, This conference,
it is amazing.
The Polish press trumpeted that this was a huge success for the Polish diplomacy. The Rzeczpospolita, one of the two biggest Polish newspapers, wrote that basically it's like Madrid in 1991. Well, immediately a lot of people just laughed at it in Poland, because they noted the difference. In 1991, people were talking about peace in the Middle East, about military forces being kind of, creating a safe zone there. Now we're talking about
war.
War, exactly. About basically containing Iran, which in the American modern language means war, right? We have basically the former New York City Mayor Giuliani meeting the representatives of this organization, Mujahideen-e-Khalq, MEK, which committed a terrorist act during the conference.
Well,
they committed a terrorist act
the
in
good
Iran.
graces of the Messiah president for the left, Barack Obama,
Absolutely.
took them off the terrorist list.
Yes, and these people, whatever their purposes, maybe they're lofty, but the methods that they used are terrible. There were people killed in Iran, and Giuliani, after meeting them, says, let me quote it, "Everyone agrees that Iran is the #1 state sponsor of terrorism in the world. That has to tell you something. Iran is a country you can't rely on, do business with. You can't trust it." Okay, so
I think you and I and Alex and our audience knows what country that is, and it's not Iran.
It's not Iran.
Let me go back to Alex in Athens here. Again, a self-inflicted wound here because the highest officials in the foreign policy elite of the EU boycotted it. They didn't want to have anything to do with it. And also, as we've said previously, when Benjamin Netanyahu got on the plane on his own website page, it was, this is, I'm paraphrasing here, conclave for war against Iran. Well, I think by the time he landed on in Warsaw, they had to change that to conflict, okay? Because Arab leaders were there, and they said, "Well, we didn't sign up for that kind of language here." I mean, it looks like the administration is just completely tone deaf. And then this administration, when it comes to Iran, even though it's a continuity of American foreign policy, its allies around the world are not in lockstep. And this is very frustrating for Pompeo, for Pence, and for Bolton. Go ahead, in Athens.
Yeah, this meeting is a complete mystery why it even went on. I mean, no one can really explain the purpose of this meeting and this conference at all. Low-level diplomats were sent to this conference. Meanwhile, you had Pompeo and Pence, the two of the highest officials from the U.S. government, are sitting there with low-level diplomats from the EU and other Arab nations. From the beginning until the end, this conference was a complete disaster. You mentioned the tweet by Netanyahu where he said this about war with Iran. They had to change that nearly an hour or two later. So this was sitting on his website and on Twitter, where he said the goal of this conference was for war with Iran. And then you had Mike Pence giving a speech to everybody there where he reiterated the fact that conflict needs to happen with Iran. He said that Iran cannot be trusted. He urged the European nations to get on board with the United States. The whole thing was a disaster from beginning to end. And I just scratched my head wondering, why did they even put this conference together? It was a PR, a foreign policy disaster. And it is, Peter, as we said, a self-inflicted wound on Trump. The Iran policy is a big blotch on the Trump administration. He has started the Iran policy from the minute he got into office till now has been one big blunder. He needs to rethink this entire policy with Iran.
You know, Alex, before we let you go here, I mean, again, it flies in the face of his campaign promises of not starting, even though I think technically Iran isn't in the Middle East, but I mean, in the greater Middle East, not to start new wars there. And then we have, in the second half of the program, we're going to talk about Venezuela. It seems a betrayal of that trust that he ran on. 20 seconds to you. Go ahead, Alex.
I agree, Peter. It's a betrayal of that trust. And we need to understand this was one of Trump's major campaign points. He was not going to get the U.S. involved in any military interventions, and he was actually going to pull the U.S. out of the Middle East. He needs to keep that promise. Otherwise, in 2020, he is going to be in trouble. He needs to realize this.
Okay, let me jump in here. I know you'll be with us in the future to see if he does keep his promise. I want to thank Alex Christoforou in Athens for joining us. We're going to go to a short break, and after that short break, we'll continue our discussion on some real news. Stay with our team. Welcome back to Crosstalk, where all things are considered. I'm Peter Lavelle. To remind you, we're discussing some real news. Okay, now we're joined in London by Marcus Papadopoulos. He's the editor of Politics First magazine. Marcus, great to have you here. Let's talk first of all about the real war in terms of sanctions, and most importantly right now, the media war against Venezuela coming out of the West, primarily the United States. As before we start talking, I'd like to point out to our viewers here, the organization Fairness and Accuracy in Reporting, or FAIR, has a brilliant article titled Venezuela Coverage Takes Us Back to the Golden Age of Lying About Latin America. And I sent you the link there. I mean, I think it's a brilliant article, and it shows the sham that's being portrayed about Venezuela that is actually inciting not only sanctions and a media war against it, but may ignite actually a military conflict. Go ahead, Marcus in London.
Let me, first of all, Peter, set the scene by saying, historically speaking, that the United States has long had disdain, total disdain for Latin America, and Washington has instigated countless coups in Latin America, and that is what they are attempting to do today in Venezuela. America has orchestrated the tension on the border between Venezuela and Colombia as a way of giving a pretext to Washington to take military action against Venezuela. And as always, Western mainstream media, or should we just be more precise, corporate media in the United States and in the UK, is peddling those lies. Recently, Peter, the United Nations Rapporteur for Human Rights visited Venezuela, and he traveled quite extensively across Venezuela. He compiled a report, and he said clearly and categorically, there is no humanitarian crisis in Venezuela. There is no food crisis in Venezuela. However, has any media outlet in the United States or Britain picked up on that? No. Has the Guardian newspaper run a front page interview with this man? No, because what he said does not fit with the narrative. Let me also add this as well, Peter. In the 1980s and the 1990s, Venezuela was ruled by numerous right-wing governments.
Exactly.
And during that period of time, there were millions of Venezuelans living in abject poverty. Untold numbers, Peter, died because of starvation and malnutrition. Ever since Chavez came to power and then succeeded by Maduro, millions of Venezuelans have been lifted out of poverty. You don't hear about that on Fox News or CNN or Sky News or Channel 4 News because it doesn't fit
the narrative. You know, Dima, I mean, I say to our audience here, take a look at the RT website and Gray Zone. Max Blumenthal has a brilliant video of him in a supermarket in Caracas. And I don't want to be a spoiler here, but I mean, it just confirms everything we've just heard from Marcus here. Where are we in this coup, Dima? Because I've described the first part, this random Guaido, whoever he is, okay, because he's not, he's obviously a stalking horse for the U.S. in this so-called Lima group, which is obviously directed against Venezuela and the current legitimate government there. But it seems to me the first part of this is the shock and awe. Well, it was a bit shocking, but the awe element has kind of receded here. We've seen also vivid footage on the border of these quote-unquote humanitarian aid. I wonder if that was Elliot Abrams' idea, because he's done it before, and he lied about it, okay? And he was given, unfortunately, a presidential pardon for his crimes that he committed in the 1980s under the Reagan administration. Where are we now in this coup?
Well, first about the coverage. I think there was a brilliant article on fair.org by Mark Cook. You know, he just decided to check the reports from the Time magazine and from other media outlets in the United States that there is no aspirin in Venezuela. You know, people cannot get treated even for a flu. You know. And he just went and bought it, you know. All of these over-the-counter medicines were available, right? So much for the fairness of the media. And as Mark Cook rightly writes in his article, you can see from these numerous stories in the U.S. media that they are written by the people who have never been to Venezuela. You know, they even use the same language. You know, Jonathan Steele, a veteran correspondent for The Guardian, he just counted how many times the adjective drab was used for Venezuela. We heard about the drab life in the Soviet Union, about drab conditions in the socialist Soviet bloc countries. So they just repeat the same narrative. They don't have to go to Venezuela to write it.
But all these countries are the same if they're considered an enemy.
As for the strategy of the United States, strangely, Mike Pompeo in Warsaw during that infamous conference that we have just described, when he was talking about Iran, he described the strategy for Venezuela. Let me quote him. Things are now much worse for the Iranian people, and we are convinced that will lead to the Iranian people to rise up and change the behavior of the regime. End of quote. So this guy is happy. He's glad that things are worse for the Iranians, that things are worse for the Venezuelans.
But these sanctions against Iran and Venezuela, they're not against the people. Of course they're against the people. Let me go back to Marcus here. Marcus, I think you made a point, and I don't think it can be stressed enough here, is that everyone knows me as a conservative person, okay, and conservative outlook here. But there is no denying that under Chavez, millions and millions of people were pulled out of poverty. And more than that, they were given political agency. Democracy meant something to those people for the first time in their entire existence, for generations in the entire history of the Venezuelan state. So Mike Pompeo and John Bolton and Elliot Abrams think that people are going to revolt against the government that has given them so much, while at the same time not denying some of the hardships that are there today. Go ahead in London.
Well, look, Peter, were mistakes made by Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro? Of course, mistakes were made by both of them. You tell me, Peter, a president, a prime minister who doesn't make mistakes. However, the most important legacy from the time of Hugo Chavez is that Venezuela was given back to the Venezuelan people. Dignity was restored to Venezuela. Venezuela's state industries and natural resources were given back to the Venezuelan people. And it is that, first and foremost, that makes people in Washington and London foam at the mouth, including those wretched journalists in inverted commas, who work for corporate media. And I will also add this, Peter, very, very quickly. It's not just the likes of Trump, the Clintons, Obama, Bush, Albright and Bolton who should be in an international court tried for crimes against humanity. It is the owners and editors of corporate media outlets who should also be joining them in the dock.
Okay, I want to stay with Marcus here because you're turning into my Sherpa explaining the quagmire. I've used that word a lot in this program these days, called Brexit. What's going on with Brexit? And what you and I have disagreed on this topic over the years, that's fine. And that's good because debate and difference of opinion are good. But tell me how this is working out or not working out in terms of a democracy deficit. Because I think for me, in my conservative outlook, I'm most concerned with this deficit here, and that's one of my gripes with the EU in general. Go ahead, my friend. Explain what's the latest stage of Brexit.
Well, I think we disagree when it comes to a referendum. We agree in that we don't like the European Union, yes. And I've never liked the European Union. But what I would say, Peter, about the Brexit camp and the Remain camp, both are instinctively anti-Russian, and both are claiming that a referendum or a second referendum would constitute democracy. Democracy is not a referendum. Democracy involves people electing other people to represent them at Parliament. That is democracy.
We agree on that. We agree on that. We agree on that.
Get away. Now, what's happening? Well, Britain is supposed to leave the European Union on the 29th of March. I sincerely hope it happens. But we must, in Britain, we must have a sensible, negotiated deal with the European Union, one that is approved by British business, British industry, and also foreign investors. Because, Peter, if the UK loses investors like the Chinese, the Japanese, and the Indians, we will be in serious trouble. However, personalities in the Brexit camp and the Remain camp are dictating events. They don't really care about the economy so much. All they care about is pursuing their own selfish ambitions. Well, so we have people like Chuka Umunna, who wants to be leader of the Labour Party. We have Jacob Rees-Mogg, Boris Johnson, who believe they have a God-given right to be the next Prime Minister of the United Kingdom. And ordinary people in Britain, the ordinary needs, the needs of ordinary Britons up and down the UK are being sidelined because of these awful personalities at Westminster.
Well, you're not going to get an argument about the personalities here. Let me give the last few words to Dmitry Babich here. Okay, there was 2 years. They were given a 2-year period to negotiate this thing here. One has to, I will express my opinion, and I think it will be history will judge, but it looks like to me this was an intentional strategy of not having a deal before the Brexit happened itself. It's a form of scaremongering, and it's succeeding here because there are plenty of people that say they want another vote, they want to extend the period of withdrawal. If that's the case, then Theresa May and her conservative backers won. 30 seconds go to you, my friend.
I think the story is that people are being punished for doing a protest vote. In the United States, people voted for Trump because they wanted an end to the war in Syria and to the war in Ukraine and to the war in Libya. And they've been shown now that this is not going to happen, right? The same story with Brexit. People voted to get out of the European Union. And now the message is from the European Union, it's my way or highway. It's us or chaos.
Okay, I'm going to jump in here. I'm going to agree with Marcus Papadopoulos because we've talked about it so many times. I'm not really sure if people really did know what they were voting for, and I think that's the problem here. And there's no single majority in Parliament how to move forward. We'll be talking about this more. Many thanks to my guests in Moscow and in Athens and in London. And thanks to our viewers for watching us here at RTC. See you next time, and remember, crosstalk rules.